I love what President Harry Truman says about this. He says, this is a Christian nation. In this great country of ours has been demonstrated the fundamental unity of Christianity and democracy. He says, the fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teachings which we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days. Yeah, I agree. And that was 50 years ago he said that. And by the way, you know who he's addressing here? Not a bunch of preachers. It was the conference of all the attorney generals of the United States. All the chief law enforcement officers right there. And he says, guys, let's not forget that what we have in the Bill of Rights all comes out of the Bible. We all know that. And we need to keep emphasizing that because we know, man, how far that is from where we are. That's a president reminding all these state attorney generals keep emphasizing. See, I don't think most Christians can point to the rights of conscience protected in the First Amendment and point to the 30 verses of the New Testament on which that First Amendment was built. I don't think most Christians could point to the biblical right of self-defense, is what the founding fathers called the Second Amendment. Can you point to the Bible verses that give you the right to defend yourself? And by the way, the Bible allows you to shed blood for 3 reasons without getting in trouble. And so we could go through that. We knew that for self-defense, for justified wars, and for civil justice, you can shed blood. But if you ever shed innocent blood, you're in big trouble with God, which is a problem with abortion. There's a big difference between abortion and capital punishment. One's guilty blood, one's innocent blood. See, we drew those lines back then. That was in the law books. That's what we studied and knew. So this is part of that modernism or minimalism where we reduce it just to one thing. Now, how do you avoid minimalism? Well, Paul had to fight that back then. He says, I'm not hesitating to proclaim the whole account. I'll give you all 27 reasons we separated from Great Britain. I won't give you just one. I'm going to give you the whole thing. See, you proclaim the whole counsel. You don't just pick and choose out the parts that you want. In the same way, Paul also said, be a workman that rightly divides the word of truth. Get in there and read the entire Declaration of Independence. Next time somebody tells you, well, what's about taxation, about representation, go, okay, what about the 16 clauses above that? And what about the 11 clauses below that? Give me the rest of those. And they won't have a clue what you're talking about. But see, that's because you rightly divide the stuff. You go in and see what it is. That's the 4th malpractice. The 5th and final malpractice we'll cover, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, is deconstructionism. It's a steady flow of negatives about Western institutions, beliefs, and values in order to tear down the old certainties on which Western culture is founded. In other words, we just chip away at things like marriage and things like faith and things like family and things like, we just chip away, just beat the dickens out of those stuff. How do we do that? Let me give you an example. Tear down old certainties. Well, there's ways of doing that. Alexis de Tocqueville, you may be aware of his work, Democracy in America. He wrote that in 1831 after spending several months traveling here. He wanted to see what made us so different, and he's the guy who coined the term American exceptionalism. Here's his book, by the way. If you want to read Democracy in America, it's really cool. See that book? Now, we still teach this in colleges today. It's in literature courses. By the way, here's the book we use for colleges. Anything missing there, maybe? This one says it's abridged for the modern reader. Really? What is it the modern reader doesn't need? Took out all the stuff on faith and family and marriage, etc. See, the modern reader doesn't need that. So what we do is we'll give you the Tocqueville minus all the stuff. He said, when I came to America, the first thing that struck me was the religious nature of the country. He said, in France, I'd always found religion and politics marching in opposite directions. Here I found they were intimately joined together. We don't get that in this one. See, the modern reader doesn't need to know that. That's deconstructionism. That's tearing down the old values and parts of the culture on which Western civilization is based. We get the same thing with books like this. Don't know much about history. This is a best-selling history book used all over the United States. And as you go in, you can learn something about all parts. Say you want a revolution. So now we're talking about American Revolution. See there? Patrick Henry to the House of Burgesses. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of change and liberty? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Pretty cool phrase. Oh, by the way, there is an ellipse in the middle of that. I wonder what's missing right there. Only 4 words are missing right there. What it says is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. Oh, I see, his acknowledgement of God. We don't need that today. So we'll put an ellipse there to take God out. That's a historical quote. It's only 4. The ellipse is as long as the phrase is, just about. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go to 1620. Mayflower Combat. We whose names are underwritten, what's missing? We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for the glory of God the advancement of the Christian faith. Now, we don't want to say something like that. We got to take that out. See, that's deconstructionism. And let me show you George Washington. This book, The Maxims of George Washington, this little book right here. Now, this is a reprint of this little book right here. This is the original. This is from 1855. This is done by John Frederick Schroeder right here. And in 1832, they came out with the first set of George Washington's writings. And so what happened was Schroeder went through that 1832 edition of Washington's writings and found all the cool quotes he had on political, social, moral, and religious maxims. And under each of those four categories, he got all sorts of subdivisions. You know, you got agriculture, and you got fine arts, and you got military, and whatever. And at the beginning of each of those sections, he had people who actually knew Washington in that aspect personally talk about Washington's demeanor, behavior in that aspect. So political, he's got all the guys that served with him in Congress, and when it's the military stuff, he talks about the generals, and all these guys say, yeah, I knew Washington from this aspect. Well, when he gets over to the religious aspect, it's fairly interesting there. See, Christianity, you have a statement here from J.M. Sewell. Now, J.M. Sewell is a poet, friend of George Washington. He'd known him for a long time. And it says, George Washington is a firm believer in the Christian religion. Below that, you have Chief Justice John Marshall, who had been on Washington's staff in the military, Chief Justice, U.S. Supreme Court. He says he was a sincere believer in the Christian faith. Elias Boudinot, who is Washington's boss in the Revolution, he's the first attorney admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court bar. He's the guy who ended the Revolution, signed the Peace Treaty of 1783. He said the general was a Christian. You have here Jeremiah Smith, a federal judge appointed to the court by George Washington in New Hampshire. It said he was not ashamed of his Christian profession. You have Devereux Jarrett, who is Washington's pastor, his Anglican priest from his church there in Virginia. He said he was a professor of Christianity. You have Jared Sparks, chaplain of Congress, historian, who said he was a Christian in faith and practice. That's a lot of eyewitness people, wouldn't you say? I mean, people who knew him, who served with him. Well, that's 1855. We came out with this new version, the 1987 version. And what the 1987 version did is it kept all the maxims there, but it just went in and took all the eyewitnesses and removed all of them, just pulled all of them out. And it has a professor tell us about George now. So the professor says, well, George was a product of the Enlightenment, and his terms for God included divine law. And like many deists, really, everybody who knew him said he was a Christian, but now we got a great PhD who's told us he's a deist. See, that's deconstructionism. That's chipping away at faith, at value, etc. And that's what we get so often. And it's only where you can only recognize this if you've actually studied some of the history. You know, then you see how this is being done.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. How should we respond if confronted with frustration and conflict? The proper response was given over 200 years ago in a lengthy speech when Benjamin Franklin told the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need His assistance? God governs in the affairs of men. I therefore move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Benjamin Franklin knew that prayer was the proper response.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact Wall Builders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
So that's deconstructionism. Now, tearing down the old certainties, but there's another thing. Remember, it also said it's a steady flow of negatives. Always pointing out sniping about everything that's wrong. Great example is the Puritans. You know, you look in any textbook today about the Puritans, and what you're going to see is how intolerant these people were. And we know they're intolerant. How do we know they're intolerant? Because they did the witch trials in 1691, 1692. You know, it's an interesting thing, those witch trials that they did in that period of time. The story, and in that period of time, 27 people were put to death, and there's the result of the witch trials, and that's bad stuff. 27 deaths, that's deplorable. What's interesting, however, is not the 27 put to death. What's interesting is how the trials came to a stop. The trials came to a stop when 3 Christian ministers and leaders, John Wise, Increase Mather, and Thomas Brattle, they went to Governor William Phipps and said, Phipps, look what the Bible says about judicial rules of evidence. You're not following this in the courts. You're putting people to death and not following. See, this is the stuff they got out of Fox's Book of Martyrs in the Bible. They went to him with that and said, look what you're doing. He looked at that and said, you're right. He called in Judge Samuel Sewell and said, stop the trials. We're not following the biblical rules of evidence on this thing. They got the trial stopped. It's interesting that Sewell stood up in church and repented in front of church for having put people to death for not following the Scriptures, that he should have followed the Scriptures. If he had to follow the Scriptures, they'd still be. And then Sewell called a colony-wide day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, seeking to avert God's judgment for having not followed the Scriptures and what they did. Now, 27 lives lost, that's bad stuff. Did you know Europe had witch trials at the same time? You know how many people were put to death in the European witch trials? 500,000 died in the European witch trials. Oh, let's see, 27 in America, 500,000 in Europe. How come we hear about America, not Europe? And by the way, European witch trials lasted for years, and the American witch trials lasted for 2 months. And by the way, juries, after those 27 were convicted and the preachers pointed out the biblical rules of evidence, the next 52 defendants in court were acquitted by the jury because the judge wouldn't follow them. The judge says, you have to convict. And they said, nope. See, we believe that juries were supposed to be the things that brought justice. They were the check and the balance on the judge. We no longer believe that. That changed with the Sparf decision, 1895, and then it changed again in about the 1970s with a couple of things that changed the power of juries. But nonetheless, that's why juries existed, and that was a biblical precedent. So what we'll get is a negative. We'll get the 27, but we're not about to hear about the 500,000, nor are we going to hear that it was the Bible who stopped this stuff and kept it from going to such a high number. See, that's deconstructionism. We'll point out every wart that's ever appeared on the nose of America, but we're not going to point out anything good that happened. You see, we see that with other things as well. And by the way, we get taught the exception, not the rule. Why don't we point out that these are the guys, for example, that gave us the Republican form of government? These are the guys who started the first ever elections. They did it right out of the Scriptures. Their pastor, when you put them on the boat, said, when you get there, remember Exodus 18:21, they wrote the Mayflower Compact, started having annual elections when they got here. Wasn't going on in Europe at the time. These are the guys who gave us government accountability because they let you be elected only 1 year at a time. Even the governors elected only 1 year at a time. You had to face the people every single year. Judges, governors, everybody did. Written constitutions, the first written constitution done by these guys, they had a sermon out of Deuteronomy, out of Exodus, and then wrote the Constitution. To this day, if you go to Connecticut, on their license plate it says the Constitution State. Now why does it say that? Because that's where the first Constitution is written, by these intolerant Christians. Historians to this day tell us that the U.S. Constitution is a direct descendant of that Constitution they wrote. In the same way, they gave the first written Bill of Rights. Reverend Nathaniel Ward in 1641 said, you know what? Not only did God give us a written word, and that's what was key about the written constitutions, was they said, you look in the Bible, when God didn't just give an oral law to his people, he wrote it all down. He took Moses up on the mountain and gave him written tablets. God is into written laws so that we can tell that it doesn't change and we can hold to that account. So that's why they did the first written constitution. That's also why 3 years later they said we need a limit on government. And so Reverend Nathaniel Ward came up with the first ever Bill of Rights, had 100 articles in the Bill of Rights telling the government what it could not do to the citizens. Putting a limit and a bounds, that's limited government. That was a biblical concept. You have individual rights the government can't touch. First Bill of Rights came from these guys. They're also the guys to start the first public school movement. That came out of Proverbs 1:7. Now, all these good things that we enjoy today, we just don't say where they came from. So this is what Teddy Roosevelt said. We wouldn't even recognize America today if we took out what the Bible has created. And it would be these institutions right here. So that's one aspect of deconstructionism. Slavery and civil rights is another. We will teach every student in America in their textbooks that slavery got to start in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, when that load of 19 slaves was brought up the James River in Virginia. And that's unfortunate, and it's a bad start for America. But we never point out what happened to the second load of slaves that came to America. The second load of slaves that came to America went to these guys right here. You know what they did? They promptly freed all the slaves and imprisoned all the slave owners. Whoa, why do that? Because they cited 2 verses out of this book right here. The 2 verses they cited, Acts 17:26 and Revelation 7:9. Paul says in Acts 17:26 we're all of one blood. They said, so what are we doing enslaving our own brothers? And that's why you see the piece the anti-slavery movement used says, am I not a brother? Remember the